Welcome to Fairfax Docks. There are places in America where Christmas never came with joy. No laughter, no warmth, only cold, darkness, and blood in the snow. Ruby, Arizona is one of those places. Nestled in southern Arizona, Ruby was once a bustling mining town, but by 1940 it was abandoned. Between 1920 and 1922, 3 massacres claimed 6 lives. Their killers either caught or vanished. Miners died in cave-ins, children disappeared, and families succumbed to fear. Today, Ruby is closed to the public, but those who dare to visit report hearing phantom gunshots, children's laughter in the empty schoolhouse, and footsteps where no one stands. Every Christmas Eve at midnight, the schoolhouse bell rings, even though no one pulls the rope. Ruby, a town built on greed, soaked in blood, and cursed by Christmas, still holds its dark secrets. And if you listen closely, you can hear the bell calling the dead children home. These are the chilling stories of Ruby, Arizona. Subscribe to Fairfax Docks for more eerie tales. Our first story begins on Christmas Eve, 1921. The Ruby Mercantile and Post Office sat at the heart of town, a 2-story wooden building that served as the general store, trading post, and social hub for the entire community. It was owned and operated by Frank and Myrtle Pearson, a couple in their early 40s who had moved to Ruby in 1919, hoping to strike it rich in the mining boom. Frank was a quiet man, stocky, balding, with kind eyes and a quick smile. He'd grown up in Ohio, worked as a railroad clerk for 15 years before heading west in search of adventure and opportunity. Myrtle was petite and sharp-tongued, the kind of woman who ran the store with an iron fist, kept meticulous records in a leather-bound ledger she carried everywhere. She had a reputation for being tough but fair. She'd extend credit to miners down on their luck, but God help you if you didn't pay her back on time. Together they ran one of the most profitable businesses in Ruby, selling everything from dynamite to canned peaches, tobacco to children's toys, patent medicines to hand-sewn dolls. Christmas Eve was the busiest day of the year. By noon, the mercantile was packed wall-to-wall with customers. Miners came down from the camps, flush with cash from their monthly wages, and desperate for gifts to send home to their families back in Mexico, Texas, or California. Wives and children crowded the aisles, picking out ribbons, hard candies, oranges shipped in from California, and small wooden toys carved by local craftsmen. Horses, trains, little soldiers with painted faces. The air inside smelled of cinnamon, wood smoke, tobacco, and the faint metallic tang of desert dust that clung to everyone's clothes. A small Christmas tree stood in the corner, decorated with strings of popcorn and paper angels the local school children had made. Carols played on a gramophone behind the counter. Silent night, oh holy night, joy to the world. It should have been a joyful scene, a celebration, a moment of warmth and community in an otherwise harsh and unforgiving landscape. But Frank Pearson couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. All day he'd noticed 2 men loitering outside the store. They weren't locals. He knew every face in Ruby, every miner, every family. These men were strangers. They wore wide-brimmed sombreros pulled low over their faces, dusty syrups, and boots caked with mud. They smoked cigarettes and watched the mercantile with dark, calculating eyes. At 3 p.m., Frank mentioned it to Myrtle. "Those 2 outside," he said quietly. "I don't like the look of them." Myrtle glanced through the window. "Probably just drifters passing through. Don't worry about it." But Frank did worry. He always kept a loaded .38 revolver under the counter, hidden in a wooden box. He checked it twice that afternoon, making sure it was within reach. By 8 p.m., the store was nearly empty. The last customers, a young mother and her 2 children, bought a bag of peppermint sticks and left, their laughter fading into the cold night air. Frank locked the front door and flipped the sign to closed. Myrtle swept the floor, humming "O Little Town of Bethlehem" under her breath. The cash register was overflowing, over $3,000 in bills and coins, the equivalent of nearly $50,000 today. Frank began counting the money, stacking the bills in neat piles, while Myrtle carried armfuls of unsold merchandise to the back storeroom. They didn't hear the back door open. They didn't hear the footsteps creaking across the wooden floor. At approximately 8:45 p.m., 2 men entered through the rear loading dock. Frank Pearson looked up from the register and froze. The 2 men from outside were standing 10 feet away, their faces partially obscured by shadow. The taller man, thin and wiry, with a jagged scar running down his left cheek, held a .38 caliber revolver. The shorter man, stocky and broad-shouldered, with a thick black mustache, carried a double-barreled shotgun. For a moment, no one moved. Frank's hand inched toward the wooden box under the counter. The taller man saw the movement and raised his pistol. "Don't," he said in accented English. Frank slowly raised his hands. "Take the money. Just take it and go. We won't tell anyone." The taller man smiled, a cold, humorless smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We will." He fired. The first bullet struck Frank in the chest, just below the left collarbone. The impact threw him backward against the shelves, knocking over jars of penny candy that shattered on the floor. He tried to speak, but only a wet, gurgling sound escaped his lips. Blood poured from the wounds, soaking his shirt, pooling on the wooden floor. Myrtle screamed. She dropped the broom and ran toward the back storeroom, but the shorter man was faster. He grabbed her by the hair and dragged her backwards, slamming her against the counter. She clawed at his face, kicked at his legs, screaming for help that would never come. The shorter man pressed the barrel of the shotgun against her temple. "Por favor," Myrtle whispered. "Please." He pulled the trigger. The sound was deafening, a single thunderous blast that echoed through the store and out into the cold night. Myrtle's body crumpled to the floor behind the counter, her blood spraying across the wall, the register, the ceiling. For a moment, there was only silence. The two men stood over the bodies, breathing heavily, their faces expressionless. Then they moved quickly, efficiently. The taller man emptied the cash register, stuffing bills and coins into a canvas sack. The shorter man pried open the back office safe with a crowbar, taking an additional $800 in gold and silver coins. But before they left, they did something strange, something no one would ever be able to explain. Scattered across the floor were dozens of small wooden toys, hand-carved horses, dolls, little tin soldiers, left over from the day's sales. The two men gathered them up and arranged them in a perfect circle around Myrtle Pearson's body, as if staging some kind of ritual or game. And on the counter, using Myrtle's blood, the taller man wrote two words with his finger: "Feliz Navidad," Merry Christmas. Then they walked out the back door and vanished into the night. The discovery. The bodies weren't discovered until the next morning, Christmas Day, 1921. A local rancher named Tom Sullivan stopped by the Mercantile at 9:20 a.m. to pick up supplies for his family's Christmas dinner. He knocked on the front door. No answer. He walked around to the back and saw the loading dock door hanging open, swaying gently in the wind. Inside, he found Frank Pearson slumped against the shelves, his chest soaked in dried blood, his eyes wide and glassy. Myrtle lay on the floor behind the counter, her head surrounded by a dark halo of congealed blood. Her eyes were still open, staring at the ceiling, as if watching something no one else could see. Tom staggered outside and vomited in the dirt. Then he ran to the sheriff's office, shouting for help. By noon, the entire town had gathered outside the Mercantile. Women wept. Men stood in grim silence, their hats in their hands. Children were kept at a distance, shielded from the horror inside. The Santa Cruz County Sheriff, Raymond Walsh, a gruff, no-nonsense lawman in his 50s, arrived by horseback that afternoon. He examined the crime scene, interviewed Tom Sullivan, and studied the bloody message on the counter. "Bandits, he muttered, came across the border, probably back in Mexico by now." But Tom Sullivan pointed to the circle of toys surrounding Myrtle's body. "Why would they do that?" he asked. "Why waste time arranging toys when they just killed two people?" Sheriff Walsh had no answer. Over the next 2 weeks, Walsh interviewed every miner, every family, every drifter who had passed through Ruby in the weeks before Christmas. He followed tire tracks into the mountains. He sent telegrams to lawmen in Nogales and Hermosillo, Mexico, describing the suspects. Nothing. The two men had vanished, as if they'd never existed. Some said they fled deep into Sonora, where the Mexican authorities would never find them. Others whispered that they were killed by rival smugglers and buried in unmarked graves in the desert. A few claimed they saw two men matching the description hang from a mesquite tree near the border. Vigilante justice, swift and brutal, but no one ever confirmed it. Frank and Myrtle Pearson were buried together in the Ruby Cemetery on December 28, 1921. Over 100 people attended the funeral, the largest in the town's history. A local minister read from the Book of Psalms, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." The Mercantile remained closed for 6 months, the bloodstains still visible on the floor, the toys still arranged in their eerie circle. The building was eventually sold to a new owner, but by then the rumors had started. People claimed they heard footsteps inside the empty store at night, the creak of the loading dock door opening, the faint, distant sound of a woman screaming. And every Christmas Eve after that, at exactly 8:45 p.m., something strange happened. The haunting. In 1923, a young couple, John and Clara Hayes, took over the mercantile, determined to make a fresh start. They scrubbed the bloodstains from the floor, repainted the walls, replaced the broken shelves, and reopened the store in the spring. Business was good at first. The miners were grateful to have a reliable supply store again. Families came in to buy flour, sugar, coffee, and cloth. But as Christmas approached, Clara began to notice strange things. Items would move on their own. A jar of candy she placed on the top shelf would be on the counter the next morning. Bolts of fabric she'd stacked neatly would be unrolled across the floor. The front door would swing open even when locked. On December 15, 1923, Claire was sweeping the floor when she heard footsteps on the second floor. Slow, deliberate, pacing back and forth. She called up the stairs, no answer. She climbed up to investigate. The room was empty, but on the wooden floor, written in what looked like dust, were two words: Feliz Navidad. Claire ran downstairs, her heart pounding. That night, she told John what she'd seen. He dismissed it. Dust settles in pattern, he said. You're imagining things. But on Christmas Eve, 1923, their 6-year-old daughter Emily woke in the middle of the night, crying hysterically. Mama, she whispered, trembling, there's a lady upstairs. She's bleeding. She keeps asking where her husband is. Clara ran upstairs with a lantern. The room was empty, but on the wall, written in what looked like dried blood, were the same two words: Feliz Navidad. The Hayes family packed their belongings that night and left Ruby before sunrise. They never came back. The mercantile was abandoned after that. No one would buy it. No one would rent it. The building fell into disrepair. Windows shattered, roof caved in, walls sagging under the weight of time. But even today, over a century later, people who visit the ruins report the same thing. If you stand outside the mercantile on Christmas Eve at 8:45 p.m., you'll hear footsteps inside, the creak of the loading dock door, and the faint, desperate sound of a woman screaming. Some say if you look through the broken windows, you'll see her standing behind the counter, Myrtle Pearson, her face pale and bloodless, her eyes wide with terror, staring at the door, waiting for the men who killed her to come back, waiting to finish what they started. And if you're brave or foolish enough to step inside, you might find toys arranged in a circle on the floor, small wooden horses, tin soldiers, hand-sewn dolls, just like they were on Christmas Eve, 1921, because Myrtle Pearson is still there, still waiting, still celebrating Christmas, forever. Our second story takes place 2 years later. On Christmas Day, 1923, Ruby, Arizona sits at an elevation of 4,500 feet, nestled in the foothills of the Montana mountains. In winter, the desert transforms. Snow blankets the peaks, temperatures plummet below freezing, and the wind howls through the canyons like a chorus of lost souls. For the children of Ruby, winter was magical. They built snowmen outside the schoolhouse. They sledded down the hills on flattened pieces of tin. They threw snowballs and drank hot cocoa by the fire, while their parents told ghost stories. And on Christmas Day, after opening their presents, they played in the snow until their fingers turned numb and their mothers called them inside. But on Christmas Day, 1923, 3 children never came home. Samuel Thompson, age 10, Alice Thompson, age 8, Benjamin Thompson, age 6, the Thompson family. The Thompson children were the pride of their family, 3 bright, energetic kids who loved exploring the mountains around Ruby. Their father, Robert Thompson, was a foreman at the Montana mine, one of the most productive copper mines in the region. He was a big man, broad-shouldered and strong, with calloused hands and a booming laugh. He'd worked in mines since he was 14, and he ran a tight crew, respected but feared by the men under his command. Their mother, Helen Thompson, was a school teacher at the one-room schoolhouse in town. She was gentle, soft-spoken. With auburn hair she wore in a tight bun and spectacles that perched on the end of her nose. She taught reading, writing, arithmetic, and history to children ranging from 6 to 14 years old. She loved her job. She loved her students. But most of all, she loved her 3 children. Samuel was the oldest. Serious, responsible, always looking out for his younger siblings. Alice was the middle child, wild-haired and fearless, the kind of girl who climbed trees and skinned her knees and never cried. Benjamin was the baby, shy, quiet, with wide blue eyes and a sweet smile that could melt anyone's heart. On Christmas morning, 1923, the Thompson children woke to fresh snow. Over 6 inches had fallen overnight, blanketing Ruby in a soft, glittering layer of white. They tore through their presents with glee. Wooden toys their father had carved by hand, knit scarves and mittens their mother had made, and a brand new sled Robert had built in his workshop, painted red with iron runners that gleamed like silver. The children begged to go outside. Helen hesitated. The temperature was dropping. The wind was picking up. Dark clouds were rolling in from the north, bringing the promise of a blizzard. But it was Christmas. She relented. "Stay close to town," she warned, wrapping scarves around their necks and pulling wool caps down over their ears. "And be back before dark. Do you understand?" The children nodded eagerly. "We promise, Mama," Samuel said. They grabbed their new sled, ran outside, and disappeared into the snow, their laughter echoing through the cold air. That was the last time anyone saw them alive. The search begins. By 5 p.m. the sun had set, and the children still hadn't returned. Helen stood at the window, wringing her hands, watching the snow fall harder and faster. Robert came home from the mine at 6 p.m., exhausted and covered in dust. When he saw the look on Helen's face, he knew something was wrong. "Where are the children?" he asked. "They went out this morning," Helen whispered. "They should have been back hours ago." Robert grabbed his coat, his lantern, and his rifle. He ran through town, knocking on doors, asking if anyone had seen Samuel, Alice, or Benjamin. No one had. By 8 p.m., a search party of 20 men had formed. They carried lanterns, torches, ropes, and blankets. They combed the hills around Ruby, calling the children's names into the wind, following sled tracks in the snow that led east, toward Montana Peak, a jagged, snow-capped mountain that loomed over Ruby like a sentinel. The tracks were clear at first, cutting through fresh powder in long, straight lines. But as the searchers climbed higher, the wind began to erase them. Snow fell in thick, blinding sheets. Visibility dropped to less than 10 feet. The temperature plummeted to 10 degrees. By midnight, the searchers were frostbitten, exhausted, and disoriented. Several men had gotten separated from the group and had to be guided back by shouting. One miner nearly fell into a ravine hidden by snow. At 2 a.m., Robert Thompson made the agonizing decision to turn back. "We'll try again at first light," he said, his voice breaking. The search party retreated to town, their hearts heavy with dread. Helen Thompson didn't sleep that night. She sat by the window, staring at Montana Peak, praying for a miracle. It never came, the storm. On December 26th, the blizzard worsened. Wind howled through Ruby at over 50 miles per hour, tearing shingles off roofs and knocking down power lines. Snow piled in drifts 6 feet high. The temperature dropped to 20 degrees. Visibility was zero. No one could leave their homes. For 3 days, the blizzard raged. Families huddled by their fires, burning every piece of wood they had, rationing food, wondering when the storm would end. Helen Thompson sat in her rocking chair by the window, unmoving, unseeing, her mind lost in a fog of grief and terror. On December 29th, the storm finally broke. The sun rose over Montana Peak, casting long shadows across the snow. The air was still, silent, unnaturally quiet. Robert Thompson organized a second search party, 30 men this time, carrying shovels, ropes, and medical supplies. They followed the original sled tracks as far as they could, then spread out in a grid pattern, searching caves, ravines, abandoned mine shafts, and every inch of the mountain. By afternoon, they had found nothing. And then, at approximately 2:30 p.m., a miner named Jake Thornton found them. The discovery, Jake was searching a small clearing about half a mile below the peak when he saw something that made him stop cold. 3 small figures sitting in the snow. At first, he thought they were snowmen, sculptures the children had built before they got lost. But as he got closer, his stomach dropped. They were real. Samuel, Alice, and Benjamin Thompson, frozen solid. But they weren't huddled together for warmth. They weren't curled up in fear. They weren't lying down, overcome by hypothermia. They were sitting upright in a perfect circle, facing each other, their legs crossed, their hands resting on their knees, as if they had been playing a game. Jake Thornton would later describe the scene in a letter to his brother, a letter that still exists in the Arizona Historical Society archives. I found them just past the old trapper's cabin in a clearing where the snow had drifted deep. At first I thought they were statues, three little figures sitting perfectly still, like dolls arranged by some giant hand. But as I got closer, I realized they were real. Samuel was sitting with his back straight, his hands resting on his knees, his face turned toward the Alice. Alice had her hands folded in her lap like she was praying, her head tilted slightly as if listening to something. Benjamin was smiling, not a scared smile, not a frozen grimace of pain, a real peaceful smile like he was happy. They were blue. Frost covered their skin like lace. Their eyes were open but clouded over with ice. Their clothes were stiff, frozen solid, and in the center of the circle there was a sled, but it wasn't their sled. This one was old, ancient even, made of blackened wood and rusted iron runners. It looked like it had been buried in the snow for decades. The paint was peeling, the wood was cracked and splintered. On the sled, someone had carved words into the wood. I had to brush away the snow to read them. "Play with us." I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I reached the others. I told them what I'd seen. Sheriff Walsh and 5 men went back with me to retrieve the bodies. But when we got there, the old sled was gone. Just gone, like it had never been there at all. The funeral. The Thompson children were buried together in the Ruby Cemetery on January 3rd, 1924. It was the coldest day of the year. The ground was frozen solid, and it took 8 men with pickaxes 2 hours to dig the grave. Over 200 people attended the funeral, nearly the entire population of Ruby and the surrounding ranches. Helen Thompson stood at the graveside, silent and still, staring at the 3 small coffins. She didn't cry, she didn't speak, she didn't move. Robert stood beside her, his face carved from stone, his hands clenched into fists. The minister read from the Bible, "Suffer the little children to come unto me, and forbid them not, for of such is the kingdom of God." But the words felt empty, hollow, because everyone knew the truth. Those children hadn't died of cold. They had died of something else, something that was still out there, waiting. The haunting Helen Thompson never spoke another word after the funeral. She spent the rest of her life sitting in a rocking chair by the window, staring at Montana Peak, her mind lost in a place no one could reach. She died in 1930, and some say it was a blessing. Robert Thompson left Ruby 6 months after the funeral. He was never heard from again. Some say he went to California. Others say he went into the mountains one night and never came back. But the story of the Thompson children didn't end with their burial. Every Christmas day after 1923, hikers near Montana Peak report hearing the same thing: children's laughter, not joyful, not playful, hollow, echoing, like it's coming from inside the mountain itself. In 1930, a group of hunters found 3 small sets of footprints in the snow near the clearing where the Thompson children died. The footprints led in a circle, over and over, as if the children were walking in an endless loop. The hunters followed the tracks for an hour, but they never ended, just circled and circled and circled, forever. In 1947, a photographer hiking Montana Peak on Christmas morning claimed he saw 3 figures sitting in the snow, small, child-sized, perfectly still. He raised his camera to take a picture. The figures turned their heads toward him in perfect unison, and then they vanished. In 1989, a couple camping near Montana Peak woke on Christmas morning to find their tent surrounded by small handprints in the frost, dozens of them pressed against the fabric from the outside, as if children had been standing around the tent all night, watching them sleep. When they unzipped the tent, no one was there, but in the snow, 20 feet away, was an old wooden sled, blackened, rusted, cracked, with words carved into the wood, "Play with us." The couple left the sled where it was and drove away. They never came back to Ruby. The warning. Today, locals warn visitors to stay away from Montana Peak on Christmas Day, because if you hear children laughing in the snow, don't follow it. If you see 3 small figures sitting in a clearing, don't approach them. And if you find an old wooden sled with the words "Play with us" carved into the wood, run, because the Thompson children are still up there, still waiting, still playing their game, and they're looking for someone new to join them forever. Our third story takes us deep beneath Ruby into the heart of darkness itself. The Montana mine was the lifeblood of Ruby, Arizona. Opened in 1912, it produced millions of dollars worth of copper, lead, and zinc over its operational lifetime. At its peak in the early 1920s, over 300 men worked the mine in rotating shifts, digging, drilling, blasting, and hauling ore from depths exceeding 800 feet below the surface. Mining was brutal work. The tunnels were narrow, suffocating, barely wide enough for a man to crawl through on his hands and knees. The air was thick with dust and the acrid smell of dynamite. Water seeped through cracks in the rock, pooling in stagnant puddles that bred disease and turned the tunnels into slippery death traps. The temperature underground hovered around 90 degrees year-round, even in winter, turning the mine into a sweltering, claustrophobic hell, and the danger was constant. Cave-ins, gas leaks, flooding, explosions. Between 1912 and 1924, 27 men died in the Montana mine, crushed by falling rock, asphyxiated by toxic fumes, drowned in flooded shafts, or buried alive when tunnels collapsed. Their bodies were carried out in canvas sacks and buried in unmarked graves on the outskirts of town, forgotten within a week. But the worst disaster came on Christmas morning, 1924, the night shift. On Christmas Eve, 1924, 14 men reported for the midnight shift at the Montana mine. Most were Mexican immigrants, men who had crossed the border looking for work, men with families back home in Sonora, men who sent every dollar they earned south in crumpled envelopes and prayed they'd make it home alive. A few were locals, hardened miners who had spent years underground, their lungs black with silica dust, their hands calloused and scarred, their spirits broken by decades of backbreaking labor. The foreman was Miguel Herrera, a wiry man in his mid-30s with a thick mustache, deep-set eyes, and a scar across his jaw from a mine accident years earlier. Miguel was respected, even loved by his crew. He always took the most dangerous jobs himself. He shared his lunch with men who had none. He sang corridos, traditional Mexican ballads, while they worked, his voice echoing through the tunnels, keeping spirits high in the darkness. That night, Miguel led his crew down to level 7, the deepest, most dangerous section of the mine, over 800 feet below the surface. Their job was to clear a collapsed section of tunnel that had been blocked for weeks, preventing access to a rich vein of copper ore that the company desperately wanted to mine. It was backbreaking work, hauling tons of loose rock by hand, shoring up weakened walls with timber supports, and setting dynamite charges to blast through stubborn sections of stone. The air was thin, oxygen-starved, and the men gasped for breath with every shovelful of rubble they moved. By 11:00 p.m., they had made good progress. The blocked tunnel was nearly clear. By midnight, Christmas Day, they were exhausted, covered in dust and sweat, ready to finish the shift and head home to their families. Miguel checked his pocket watch, a silver timepiece his father had given him on his wedding day. "One more blast," he said in Spanish, wiping sweat from his brow. "Then we're done. We'll be home by 2 a.m. The men cheered weakly. Miguel set the charge, a stick of dynamite wedged into a crack in the rock, and lit the fuse with a match. The fuse hissed and sparked, burning slowly toward the explosive. The crew retreated 50 feet down the tunnel, covering their ears, turning their backs to the blast. Miguel counted down. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The explosion echoed like thunder, shaking the walls, sending showers of dust and pebbles cascading from the ceiling. And then the ceiling came down. The collapse. At exactly 12:17 a.m. on Christmas Day, 1924, over 200 tons of rock collapsed in the level 7 tunnel. The sound was deafening, a roar like a freight train, followed by a choking cloud of dust that filled the air and turned the world black. Men screamed, timber supports splintered like matchsticks. The ground shook so violently that miners working on level 4, over 400 feet above, felt the tremors through the soles of their boots. When the dust settled, the tunnel was gone. A solid wall of rubble, 10 feet thick, separated Miguel Herrera and his 13 men from the rest of the mine. They were entombed alive. The rescue attempt, word of the collapse, reached the surface within minutes. By 1 a.m., over 50 men were working to clear the rubble, digging, hauling, praying. The mine's superintendent, Charles Whitlock, a thin, nervous man in his 50s, coordinated the effort from the surface, sending down fresh crews every 2 hours to relieve the exhausted workers. But the rock was dense, compacted, nearly impossible to move without heavy machinery. And there was no machinery in Ruby that could handle this kind of disaster. Every time they cleared a few feet, more rubble cascaded down from above, filling the gap. Timber supports kept cracking under the weight. The air in the tunnel grew thin, heavy with dust and the metallic smell of blood. By dawn, they had made less than 6 feet of progress. Charles Whitlock stood at the entrance to the mine, his face gray with exhaustion and fear. "How long do they have?" he asked the head engineer, a grizzled man named Bill Hutchins who had worked in mines for 40 years. Bill lit a cigarette with trembling hands and stared into the darkness. "If they're alive, maybe 48 hours, maybe less. Depends on how much air is trapped down there. Depends on if they're injured. Depends on if they panic. And if we can't reach them in time." Bill didn't answer. He didn't have to. The singing. On the second day, December 26, 1924, something strange happened. At approximately 2:09 p.m., one of the rescue workers, a young miner named Danny O'Brien, stopped digging and held up his hand. "Do you hear that?" The other men fell silent, straining to listen over the sound of their own breathing and the distant drip of water. And then they heard it, singing, faint, distant, but unmistakable. It was coming from behind the wall of rubble, from the sealed tunnel where the 14 men were trapped. The rescuers pressed their ears against the rock, listening. The song was a corrido, a traditional Mexican ballad. The melody was slow, mournful, filled with longing and sorrow. The words were in Spanish, but Danny O'Brien, who had worked alongside Miguel Herrera for years, recognized the song immediately. It was La Llorona, the Weeping Woman, a folk song about a ghostly mother who drowned her children in a river and now wanders the earth forever, crying for them, searching for them, unable to find peace. The rescuers looked at each other, their faces pale. "They're alive," Danny whispered. "They're still alive." Charles Whitlock, standing nearby, felt a surge of hope. "Dig faster," he shouted. "They're alive. We can still save them." The men dug with renewed energy, shovels biting into rock and rubble, hands bleeding, backs aching. But the singing didn't stop. It continued hour after hour, echoing through the stone, haunting and beautiful, the second night. By the evening of December 26th, the singing had grown louder, but something about it had changed. The melody was the same, but the voices sounded wrong, hollow, echoing, as if they were coming from a place far deeper than level 7, from somewhere that shouldn't exist. At 8 p.m., the rescue team broke through another 3 feet of rubble and stopped to listen. The singing was so close now, they could hear individual voices. Miguel Herrera's voice, deep, resonant, unmistakable, and beneath it, a chorus of other voices, harmonizing in perfect unison, their voices blending together like threads in a tapestry. But there was something else too, a 15th voice, not one of the miners, a woman's voice, high and keening, weaving through the melody like a thread of silver, beautiful and terrible all at once. Danny O'Brien frowned, his skin prickling with unease. "Who the hell is that?" he whispered. No one answered, because there were no women in the mine. There had never been women in the mine. The discovery. On the morning of December 27th, 1924, 3 days after the collapse, the rescue team finally broke through. They punched a hole through the rubble, just wide enough for a man to crawl through, and shone a lantern into the darkness beyond. The tunnel was empty. No bodies, no survivors, no sign of the 14 men, just a collapsed shaft, its walls cracked and unstable, its floor covered in loose rock and splintered timber. Charles Whitlock crawled through the opening, his lantern held high, and called out, "Miguel, can you hear me? Miguel!" His voice echoed through the tunnel and faded into silence. He climbed over the rubble, searching desperately for any sign of the men, clothing, tools, bloodstains, anything, but there was nothing. And then he saw it. At the far end of the tunnel, carved into the rock face with what looked like a pickaxe or a piece of metal, were 14 names: Miguel Herrera, Juan Morales, Carlos Vega, Pedro Salinas, Diego Ruiz, and 9 others. Each name was carved in jagged, uneven letters, as if scratched into the stone with trembling, desperate hands. Below the names, a single sentence in Spanish: "Ella nos llevó a casa." She took us home. Charles stared at the words, his blood turning to ice. Who was she? What did it mean? And where were the bodies? The aftermath. The 14 men were never found. Charles Whitlock ordered a full search of level 7, then level 6, then every tunnel, shaft, alcove, and air vent in the Montana mine. He brought in engineers, geologists, and rescue experts from across Arizona and New Mexico. They found nothing. It was as if the 14 men had simply vanished into the earth, swallowed whole by the mountain. The Montana mine was closed permanently on January 15, 1925. The entrance was sealed with concrete. A wooden cross was erected outside the mine, bearing the names of the 14 men lost in the collapse. Families held memorial services. Wives and children wept. Widows in black veils stood at gravesides with no bodies to bury, but no one ever understood what had happened. The haunting. In the years that followed, miners who worked at other shafts near Ruby, copper mines, silver mines, abandoned claims, reported hearing the same thing. Singing, always at night, always around midnight. The melody of La Llorona, echoing up from deep underground, carried on drafts of cold air that smelled of earth and decay. In 1931, a group of teenagers exploring the abandoned Montana mine broke through the concrete seal with crowbars and climbed down to level 7, armed with flashlights, rope, and enough teenage bravado to ignore every warning their parents had ever given them. At midnight, they heard the singing. It started faint, distant, like a radio playing in another room. Then it grew louder, closer, surrounding them from all sides, as if the walls themselves were singing. One of the boys, Tommy Garrett, age 16, claimed he saw a figure at the far end of the tunnel, a woman in a white dress, her hair long and black, flowing like water. Her face was pale as bone, her eyes dark and hollow. She was crying. Tears of blood streamed down her cheeks, and as she cried, the walls began to crack. Rocks fell from the ceiling. The ground shook. The boys ran, scrambling over rubble, gasping for air, their flashlights flickering and dying. They barely made it out before the tunnel collapsed again, sealing level 7 forever. The truth. Local historians have debated the Montana mine collapse for decades. Some say the 14 men were killed instantly, buried under tons of rock, and their bodies simply missed during the search. Others believe they found a hidden passage, an old tunnel or natural cave, and escaped to Mexico, abandoning their families and starting new lives under false names. But the locals know better, because every Christmas morning, at exactly midnight, people near the sealed Montana mine hear the same thing. 14 voices singing La Llorona, and beneath them, weaving through the melody like a ghost, a woman's voice, high and mournful, calling them home, calling them deeper, to a place where no light reaches, where no rescue ever comes, and where the singing never stops. The Schoolhouse Bell, Christmas Eve 1926. Sound of a distant bell tolling, children's laughter, wind through the empty hallways. Our fourth story centers on the Ruby Schoolhouse, a one-room building that still stands today, its windows shattered, its roof sagging, its walls covered in graffiti and decay. But on Christmas Eve, if you stand outside that building at midnight, you'll hear something that will freeze your blood. The bell, ringing, calling the children home. The schoolhouse, built in 1918, the Ruby Schoolhouse served as the educational heart of the community. It was a simple structure. Whitewashed wooden walls, a pitched tin roof that rattled in the wind, rows of handmade desks arranged in neat lines facing a blackboard at the front of the room. At the back of the classroom stood a pot-bellied stove that burned juniper wood and filled the air with the smell of smoke and sap during the cold winter months. The schoolhouse served children from all over the Ruby mining district. Some walked miles each day from remote cabins and mining camps, arriving with dirt-smudged faces and empty bellies. The school provided not just education, but community, warmth, and for many children, the only meal they'd get that day. The teacher was Miss Eleanor Finch, a young woman in her mid-20s from Tucson. Eleanor was educated, proper, and fiercely devoted to her students. She had studied at the Territorial Normal School in Tempe and came to Ruby in 1920, drawn by a sense of purpose and a desperate need to escape her past. Eleanor was pretty in a delicate way. Pale skin, auburn hair she wore in a tight bun, wire-rimmed spectacles that perched on her narrow nose. She dressed conservatively, always in high-neck blouses and long skirts, never showing an inch of impropriety. She taught reading, writing, arithmetic, geography, and history to children ranging from 6 to 14 years old. She organized Christmas pageants where children dressed as angels and shepherds. She held spelling bees and awarded prizes of penny candy to the winners. She stayed late every afternoon, helping students who struggled with their lessons, mending torn coats and sometimes slipping bread and cheese into the pockets of children she knew. Went home to empty cupboards. The children loved her, and she loved them back with a fierce, almost desperate intensity. But Eleanor Finch carried a secret, a darkness, a grief so deep it had hollowed her out from the inside, leaving only a shell that smiled and taught and pretended everything was fine. Eleanor's story. Before coming to Ruby, Eleanor had been engaged to a man named James Caldwell, a young soldier from Tucson who had enlisted in 1917 to fight in the Great War, the war to end all wars, they called it. James was handsome, charming, full of dreams about the life they would build together after the war. They met at a church social in 1916, fell in love over stolen conversations and chaperoned walks, and became engaged in the spring of 1917. James gave Eleanor a simple silver ring and promised he would come home to her, that they would marry in the same church where they met, that they would have children and grow old together. Eleanor believed him. She waited for him faithfully for 18 months. She wrote him letters every week, long, detailed accounts of her daily life, her teaching, her hopes for their future. She received letters back, stained with mud and filled with longing, describing the horrors of trench warfare, the constant fear, the friends he'd lost. And then the letters stopped. On November 10, 1918, one day before the armistice, one day before the war ended, James Caldwell was killed in France during the Meuse-Argonne offensive. A German artillery shell hit his trench, killing him and 7 other men instantly. Eleanor received the telegram on Christmas Eve 1918 while sitting in her parents' parlor, decorating a tree and humming carols. The telegram was brief, impersonal, devastating. Regret to inform you, Private James Caldwell killed in action November 10. Stop, further details to follow. Stop, deepest condolences, stop. Eleanor read it 3 times, her hands shaking, her vision blurring, and then she collapsed. For 2 years she lived in a fog of grief, unable to eat, unable to sleep, unable to imagine a future without James. She stopped attending church. She stopped seeing friends. She spent hours sitting by his empty grave in the Tucson cemetery, talking to a headstone with no body beneath it. Her parents begged her to move on, to find someone new, to live again. But Eleanor couldn't let go. In 1920, she applied for a teaching position in Ruby, Arizona, about as far from Tucson as she could get without leaving the state. She wanted isolation, silence, a place where no one knew her story, where she could bury her grief beneath layers of work and routine and pretend to be a person again. And for 6 years it worked. She taught, she smiled, she organized pageants and spelling bees and end-of-year recitals. But every Christmas Eve, alone in her small cabin on the edge of town, Eleanor Finch sat in the darkness and wept, clutching James's photograph to her chest, whispering his name over and over until her voice gave out. Christmas Eve, 1926. On December 24, 1926, Eleanor organized the annual Christmas pageant at the schoolhouse. It was the social event of the season. Every family in Ruby attended, crowding into the small room, standing along the walls, filling every available space. 23 children participated, dressed in costumes their mothers had sewn from flour sacks and old curtains, angels with wire hanger wings covered in cotton, shepherds with towels wrapped around their heads, wise men wearing bathrobes and cardboard crowns painted gold. The children recited their lines with varying degrees of confidence. Little Rosie Martinez, age 6, forgot her lines entirely and stood frozen in terror until Eleanor gently prompted her from off stage. Tommy Webb, age 10, knocked over the cardboard manger during his entrance, sending the baby Jesus doll rolling across the floor, which made everyone laugh. The parents clapped and cheered. Mothers wiped tears from their eyes. Fathers beamed with pride. Eleanor stood at the back of the room watching, her face serene but her heart breaking, because it was Christmas Eve, the anniversary, 8 years since the telegram, 8 years since James died, and Eleanor was tired of pretending. When the pageant ended at 9:30 p.m., the families left, bundling their children into coats and scarves and disappearing into the cold night, their voices and laughter fading into the darkness. Eleanor stayed behind, as she always did, sweeping the floor, arranging the desks back into rows, putting out the fire in the stove, washing the chalkboard. By 10:30 p.m., the schoolhouse was empty and silent. Eleanor locked the door, extinguished the lantern, and stood in the darkness, staring at the chalkboard where she had written a message for the children to see on the first day back after Christmas break. Happy New Year. See you in 1927. But as Eleanor stared at those words, something inside her broke. Because she knew she wouldn't be there in 1927. She couldn't do this anymore. She couldn't keep pretending, keep smiling, keep teaching children about futures she would never have. She was so tired, so empty, so ready for it all to end. The bell tower. At 11:45 p.m., Eleanor Finch climbed the narrow wooden ladder to the Schoolhouse Bell tower. The bell was a small brass fixture, about 18 inches in diameter, mounted on a wooden frame above the roof. A rope hung down through a hole in the ceiling, allowing the teacher to ring the bell each morning at 8:00 a.m. to call the children to class. The sound of that bell was as much a part of Ruby's daily rhythm as the whistle from the mine or the train passing through in the afternoon. Eleanor stood on the narrow platform, 30 feet above the ground, and looked out at the town. Ruby was dark, silent, blanketed in a thin layer of snow that glittered under the moonlight. She could see the lights of a few cabins still burning, families celebrating Christmas Eve, children too excited to sleep, parent wrapping last-minute presents. She could hear the distant sound of laughter and music from the saloon on Main Street. She could smell wood smoke and juniper, the familiar sense of winter in the desert. It was peaceful, beautiful even. But Eleanor felt nothing. She pulled James' photograph from her coat pocket, worn, creased, stained with years of tears. She looked at his face one last time, memorizing every detail, his smile, his eyes, the way his hair fell across his forehead. "I'm coming," she whispered. "I'm finally coming home to you." She tucked the photograph back into her pocket, close to her heart. Then she untied the bell rope from its anchor and looped it around her neck, tying it in a careful knot beneath her jaw. She took a deep breath. And at exactly midnight, as Christmas Day began, Eleanor Finch stepped off the platform. The bell rang once as she fell, a single, clear, haunting note that echoed across Ruby, cutting through the silence of Christmas night. And then nothing, just the creak of the rope, the gentle sway of her body, the cold wind whistling through the bell tower. Eleanor Finch was finally at peace. The discovery. Eleanor's body was found the next morning by Thomas Kirby, the school janitor. Thomas was a heavy-set man in his 60s who had worked at the school since it opened. He arrived at 7:00 a.m. on Christmas morning, planning to sweep the floors and prepare the building for when classes resumed after New Year's. He noticed immediately that the door was locked from the inside, which was unusual. Eleanor always left it open for him. He walked around the building and looked up, and saw her hanging from the bell tower, swaying gently in the morning breeze. Thomas dropped his broom and ran for the sheriff. Sheriff Raymond Walsh and 3 deputies cut Eleanor down at 9:00 a.m. Her body was stiff with rigor mortis, her face pale and peaceful, her eyes closed as if in sleep. The rope had snapped her neck instantly. Death would have been immediate, painless. But as they lowered her to the ground, one of the deputies, Martin Cruz, noticed something strange. Eleanor's hands were clasped together over her chest, fingers interlaced as if in prayer, but they hadn't arranged her body that way. She had been hanging with her arms at her sides. Somehow, after death, her hands had moved into that position, and around her neck, tucked carefully beneath the rope, was a photograph. A young soldier in uniform, smiling at the camera, James Caldwell. Sheriff Walsh removed his hat and bowed his head. "Poor girl," he muttered. "She never got over him." Eleanor was buried in the Ruby Cemetery on December 27, 1926. In a plot at the edge of the grounds beneath a gnarled juniper tree. Over 50 people attended her funeral, miners, families, children who had loved her. They sang hymns and placed flowers on her grave, wild desert blooms, bits of ribbon, hand-drawn pictures from her students. The schoolhouse was closed for 2 weeks out of respect. But when it reopened in January, the new teacher, Mrs. Harriet Campbell, a stern woman from Phoenix, lasted only 3 months before she quit and left Ruby forever. Because of the bell, the haunting begins. On Christmas Eve, 1927, exactly 1 year after Eleanor's death, the schoolhouse bell rang at midnight. A miner named Jacob Mills heard it from his cabin a quarter-mile away and sat up in bed, confused. His wife, Martha, stirred beside him. "What was that?" she whispered. "The school bell," Jacob said, frowning. "But why would anyone ring it at midnight on Christmas Eve?" He pulled on his boots and coat and walked toward the schoolhouse, carrying a lantern. The night was cold and still, the stars sharp and bright overhead. The schoolhouse was dark, no lights, no movement, no one there. But the bell kept ringing. Jacob circled the building, looking for pranksters, for kids playing a joke. No one. He tried the door, locked. He walked around to the side of the building and called up to the bell tower. "Who's up there? This isn't funny." The ringing stopped. Jacob waited, his heart pounding, and then he heard it, faint, distant, barely audible over the sound of his own breathing, a woman's voice singing softly, a lullaby. He couldn't make out the words, but the melody was heartbreaking. Sad, lonely, filled with longing, Jacob backed away from the building, his skin crawling with unease. He returned home and didn't speak of it again. But the next year, on Christmas Eve 1928, the bell rang again at midnight, and the year after that, and in every year since. The pattern. By 1930, everyone in Ruby knew about the bell. It became a local legend, a ghost story parents told their children, a warning to stay away from the schoolhouse on Christmas Eve. In 1932, the school board decided to remove the bell entirely, dismantling the tower and storing the bell in a wooden shed behind the building. On Christmas Eve 1932, at midnight, the bell rang from inside the shed. In 1935, they buried the bell 6 feet underground in the cemetery. On Christmas Eve 1935, at midnight, the bell rang from beneath the earth, muffled but unmistakable. People living near the cemetery swore they heard it, clear as day. In 1937, they threw the bell into an abandoned mine shaft 5 miles outside town. On Christmas Eve 1937, at midnight, the bell rang from the depths of the earth, echoing up from the darkness like a voice from hell. The town gave up, trying to silence it, the children. In 1938, something changed. A family visiting Ruby for Christmas, the Carters from Tucson, brought their 8-year-old daughter Sarah to see the abandoned schoolhouse, which had become something of a tourist attraction by then. On Christmas Eve, Sarah woke her parents at midnight, crying hysterically. "The teacher is calling us," she sobbed. "She wants us to come to class. She's ringing the bell." Her parents dismissed it as a nightmare and put her back to bed. But the next morning, Sarah walked to the schoolhouse alone while her parents were still sleeping. She pushed open the unlocked door and stepped inside. The room was exactly as it had been left in 1926. Desks in rows, chalkboard on the wall, pot-bellied stove in the corner. Dust covered everything. Cobwebs hung from the rafters. But something was different. 23 small desks were arranged in perfect rows, as if waiting for students. And on each desk, carved into the wood with a knife or a nail, was a name: Tommy, Alice, Benjamin, Rosie, Samuel, Miguel, Carlos, Maria. The names of children who had attended the Ruby School, children who had died over the years, some in accidents, some from disease, some who simply vanished into the desert and were never found. And on the chalkboard, written in perfect cursive handwriting, was a message: "Class is in session. Please take your seats." Sarah screamed and ran from the building. She never went back. Her family left Ruby that afternoon and never spoke of it again. The warning: today, the Ruby schoolhouse stands empty, its door chained shut, its windows boarded over with weathered plywood. But every Christmas Eve, at exactly midnight, the bell rings, even though the bell is gone, even though the tower was torn down decades ago, even though the bell is buried, lost, cast into the depths of the earth. The sound echoes across Ruby, clear and haunting, carried on the desert wind, calling the children home. And those who hear it say the same thing. If you listen closely, if you stand outside the schoolhouse and hold your breath and listen with every fiber of your being, you can hear a woman's voice beneath the ringing, soft, sad, desperate, calling names: Tommy, Alice, Benjamin, Rosie, Samuel, calling the dead children back to class, teaching them lessons they'll never learn, reading them stories that never end, forever. Because Eleanor Finch is still teaching, still waiting, still ringing the bell every Christmas Eve at midnight, and the children always come. 23 small figures walking through the darkness, their feet making no sound, their faces pale and empty, walking to the schoolhouse, taking their seats, opening books that crumble to dust, while their teacher stands at the chalkboard, her back to them, writing lessons in a language no living person can read, forever and ever and ever, because in Ruby, school never ends. It just repeats. Christmas night, 1940. Sound of howling wind, creaking wood, distant footsteps, a child crying. Our final story takes us to the end, the very last Christmas in Ruby, Arizona. By 1940, the town was dying. The Montana mine had closed for good in 1932, a victim of falling copper prices during the Great Depression. The mercantile had been abandoned for years, its shelves empty, its windows shattered by vandals and desert winds. The schoolhouse stood silent, haunted, avoided by anyone with sense. The saloon had burned down in 1935 under mysterious circumstances. Some said lightning, others said arson. A few whispered it was something else entirely. Most families had packed their belongings and left between 1932 and 1938, moving to Tucson, Phoenix, California, or back to Mexico, anywhere that offered jobs and a future Ruby could no longer provide. By December 1940, only 12 people remained in Ruby, scattered across the surrounding ranches and mining claims, stubborn holdouts who refused to admit the town was dead. And by Christmas night 1940, only one family was left, the Mallory family. The Mallorys, George Mallory, age 47, was a stubborn man, a trait his wife called pride and his friends called stupidity. He was tall and lean, with sun-weathered skin, calloused hands, and a jaw set in perpetual determination. He'd come to Ruby in 1915 as a young miner, worked his way up to shift supervisor, and saved every penny he earned. In 1925, he'd used his savings to buy a small ranch on the outskirts of town, 160 acres of rocky, unforgiving land where he raised cattle, goats, and chickens, and grew vegetables in a plot he'd laboriously cleared of rocks and cactus. He believed Ruby would come back. He believed the mines would reopen. He believed that any day now, the railroad would extend a line to Ruby, tourists would come to see the old mining town, and property values would skyrocket. He was wrong. His wife, Catherine Mallory, age 42, was a quiet, anxious woman who had begged George to leave for years. She was small and thin, worn down by years of isolation, hard work, and constant fear. She hated Ruby, the loneliness, the ghosts, the wind that never stopped howling, the constant feeling that something was watching from just beyond the light. She wanted to go to California, where her sister lived in a nice house in San Diego, where their children could attend real schools and make friends and have normal lives. But George refused. "This is our home," he'd say, his voice hard. "We don't run, we don't quit." They had 2 children. Daniel, age 12, was a thin, nervous boy with dark circles under his eyes and a habit of jumping at shadows. He heard voices in the walls at night, whispers, scratching sounds, his name being called in a voice that wasn't his mother's or father's. Catherine dismissed it as nightmares. George told him to toughen up. And Emma, age 8, who hadn't spoken a word in over a year, not since the night she saw something standing in her bedroom window, staring at her with eyes that reflected the moonlight like an animal's. The warning. On the morning of December 24, 1940, a drifter named Henry Cole stopped at the Mallory Ranch. Henry was in his 60s, weathered and gaunt, with long gray hair tied back in a ponytail and a beard that hadn't been trimmed in months. He carried nothing but a bedroll, a canteen, and a hunting knife strapped to his belt. He'd worked the mines in Ruby back in the 1920s and had returned, he said, to see what was left of the town. George saw him standing at the property line and walked out to meet him, rifle in hand, not pointed, but ready. "Can I help you?" George asked, his voice wary. Henry smiled, a gap-toothed, humorless smile. "Just passing through. Thought I might trouble you for some water and maybe a cup of coffee if you can spare it." George studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Come on up to the house." Catherine made coffee while Henry sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around the warm cup. The children watched him from across the room, Daniel wary, Emma silent and staring. Henry looked around the small, drafty cabin, at the peeling wallpaper, the cracked windows stuffed with rags to keep out the cold, the children huddled by the wood stove in threadbare clothes. He shook his head slowly. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly. George frowned. "Excuse me? You shouldn't be here, not in Ruby. Not anymore, especially not tonight." Catherine, standing at the sink, turned sharply. "What do you mean?" Henry took a long sip of coffee, his eyes distant. "I worked here for 3 years, back in the 20s. Saw things no man should see, heard things that made me question my sanity. The murders, the disappearances, the mine collapses. It wasn't accidents, it wasn't bad luck." "Then what was it?" George asked, his voice edged with irritation. Henry looked at him with dark, haunted eyes. "This place is cursed. The land doesn't want people here. It never did. Ruby was built on blood and greed, and the earth remembers. It takes people, swallows them whole, and it's hungry." George laughed, but it was forced. "You're talking nonsense, old man." "Maybe." Henry stood, pulling his coat tight. "But I'll tell you this. Don't stay here tonight. Not on Christmas. Something happens on Christmas in Ruby. Always has." Catherine grabbed his arm, her voice trembling. "What happens? Please, what happens?" Henry looked at her, and for a moment his expression softened with something like pity. "It comes back," he said quietly. "Everything that died here, everything that was lost, it all comes back on Christmas, and it takes whatever's left." "What comes back?" Catherine whispered, but Henry didn't answer. He walked to the door, opened it, and stepped out into the cold. "Leave," he called over his shoulder. "Before midnight. Get your family and leave Ruby. Don't look back." And then he disappeared into the desert, walking south toward the mountains. George slammed the door shut. Crazy old fool. But Catherine stood frozen, staring at the door, her heart pounding. "George," she said, "maybe we should—" "No," George snapped. "We're not running because some drifter tells ghost stories. This is our home." Catherine said nothing, but she began packing. Christmas Eve. By evening, the temperature had dropped to near zero. Snow fell in thick, silent sheets, rare for southern Arizona, but not unheard of in the mountains. George brought the cattle into the barn and reinforced the doors against the wind. Catherine cooked a simple dinner: beans, bread, canned peaches, while the children sat by the fire, saying nothing. At 8:00 p.m., the lantern in the kitchen flickered and went out. "George," Catherine called. "The oil's gone." George frowned. "I just filled that yesterday." He grabbed a spare can from the pantry, refilled the lantern, and lit it again. It went out. He tried a second lantern. It went out. By 9:00 p.m., the cabin was dark except for the glow of the fire in the wood stove. The sounds began. At 10:00 p.m., Daniel sat up in his bed and whispered, "Do you hear that?" Catherine, sitting in a chair by the fire, frowned. "Hear what, sweetheart?" "Footsteps. Outside." Everyone fell silent, listening, and then they heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crunching through the snow outside. George grabbed his rifle and walked to the window, peering through the frost-covered glass. Nothing. Just snow, darkness, silence. But the footsteps continued, circling the cabin. "Who's there?" George shouted. "This is private property. Show yourself." No answer. The footsteps stopped at the front door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Knock, knock, knock. George opened the door, rifle raised, ready to confront whoever was playing games. No one. But in the snow, 20 feet from the door, were footprints. Small, child-sized, leading away from the cabin and then circling back, over and over, as if something had been walking in circles around their home for hours. George stepped outside, following the tracks with his lantern. They led in an endless loop around the cabin, circling, circling, never stopping, never deviating. And they were fresh, still being made, right now. George looked up and saw them, dozens of small figures standing at the edge of the property just beyond the light. Silent, motionless, watching. Midnight. At exactly midnight, Emma, the little girl who hadn't spoken in over a year, stood up from her bed and walked to the window. Catherine followed her. "Emma, sweetheart, what's wrong?" Emma pressed her small hand against the glass, her breath fogging the cold surface, and whispered in a voice like rusted hinges, "They're here." "Who's here, baby?" Emma pointed into the darkness. Catherine looked, and her blood turned to ice. Dozens of small figures standing in the snow. Children, standing perfectly still, their faces pale and expressionless, their eyes dark and empty. She recognized some of them. The Thompson children, Samuel, Alice, Benjamin, Rosie Martinez, who had died of typhoid in 1925, Tommy Webb, who drowned in an irrigation ditch in 1929, and others, so many others. Dead children, all staring at the cabin, all waiting. Catherine screamed. George ran to the window and saw them too. "What the hell?" The figures began to move, slowly, in perfect unison, walking toward the cabin. The siege. George barricaded the door with furniture, the kitchen table, chairs, a heavy trunk. Catherine pulled the children away from the windows, wrapping them in blankets, whispering prayers under her breath. Daniel was crying. Emma was silent, staring at nothing. The figures reached the cabin. They didn't knock. They didn't speak. They didn't try to break down the door. They scratched. Dozens of small hands clawing at the wood, the windows, the roof. The sound was deafening, a constant rhythmic scratching, like nails on a chalkboard, echoing through the walls, filling the cabin with a sound like 1,000 rats trapped inside the walls. George fired his rifle through the door. The scratching stopped. For 10 seconds there was silence, and then it started again, louder, faster, more desperate. The message. At 2:00 a.m., Catherine found writing on the wall above the fireplace. It hadn't been there before, written in what looked like soot, in a child's uneven handwriting. "Let us in, we're cold." Below it, more words appeared as she watched, scratched into the wall by invisible hands. "We want to play. We've been waiting. It's Christmas. Let us in. Catherine grabbed Emma and Daniel and pulled them into the bedroom, slamming the door. George stood in the main room, rifle trembling in his hands, watching the door buckle under the weight of dozens of small bodies pressing against it. The wood cracked, hinges groaned. The door was about to break. The escape. At 4:00 a.m., George made a decision. We're leaving, now. They bundled the children in blankets, grabbed what little food they could carry, and ran through the back door to the barn. George hitched the horses to the wagon while Catherine held the children, whispering prayers, watching the cabin as small figures circled it, scratching, clawing, calling in voices like wind through broken windows. They climbed onto the wagon and rode into the snow, racing down the road toward Tucson, not looking back. Behind them, the cabin caught fire. No one lit a match. No one knocked over a lantern, but the cabin burned anyway, collapsing into ash and embers, flames reaching toward the sky like grasping hands. The Mallory family never returned to Ruby. They settled in Tucson and never spoke of that night again. George died in 1952 of a heart attack. Catherine died in 1960, alone in a psychiatric hospital where she'd been committed after trying to set fire to their home in Tucson, screaming that the children were coming back. Daniel spent the rest of his life in and out of institutions, claiming he still heard the scratching. Emma never spoke again. The ghosts that remain, sound of wind, distant bell, fading footsteps. Today, Ruby, Arizona is officially closed to the public. The gates are locked. The buildings are fenced off. No trespassing signs are posted every 50 feet. Security patrols the area periodically, turning away curious tourists, ghost hunters, and YouTubers hoping to catch something on camera. But that doesn't stop people from coming. They climb the fences. They break into the buildings. They film themselves walking through the empty mercantile, the crumbling schoolhouse, the sealed mine entrance. And many of them leave with stories they can't explain. Voices in the dark, shadows moving where no one stands, the sound of children laughing in the empty schoolhouse, footprints appearing in the dirt, following them, circling them. And every Christmas Eve, without fail, people camping near Ruby report the same thing. A bell ringing at midnight, footsteps in the snow, the sound of children singing. And if they're brave or foolish enough to approach the town, they see them, small figures standing in the darkness, watching, waiting, calling. Ruby, Arizona is a ghost town, but the ghosts are still here, still waiting, still celebrating Christmas, forever. Because in Ruby, Christmas never ends. It just repeats, over and over. A holiday frozen in blood and snow and sorrow. And if you ever find yourself near Ruby on Christmas Eve, remember this. If you hear the bell ring, don't follow it. If you see footprints in the snow, don't follow them. And if you hear children singing in the darkness, run, because they're not singing for joy. They're singing for you, calling you home to Ruby forever.
The Preacher's Judgment, Christmas Week 1877. Our sixth story takes us back to Christmas 1877. The year Body witnessed what became known as the Preacher's Judgment, a week-long descent into religious mania and vigilante justice that left 17 people dead and introduced a darkness to Body that some say never truly left. Reverend Josiah Blackwood arrived in Body on December 15, 1877, riding a skeletal mule and carrying nothing but a Bible, a rope, and an absolute conviction that he'd been sent by God to cleanse this den of sin. Josiah was 47 years old, tall and gaunt as a scarecrow, with burning black eyes that never seemed to blink, a long gray beard streaked with white, and hands that trembled constantly, whether from age, illness, or religious fervor, no one could say. He wore a threadbare black suit that hung from his frame like funeral shrouds, and a wide-brimmed black hat that cast his face in permanent shadow. He'd been a Methodist circuit preacher in Missouri, traveling from town to town, preaching fire and brimstone, calling sinners to repentance. But something had happened in Kansas City in 1875. The details were murky, the records incomplete. Something involving a church fire, accusations of heresy, deaths that were never fully explained. Josiah had fled west ahead of a warrant, disappearing into the territories where law was scarce and questions were rarer. For 2 years he'd wandered the mining camps of Nevada and California, preaching wherever men would listen, his sermons growing darker, stranger, more apocalyptic with each passing month. He spoke of judgment and damnation, of cities burning, of God's wrath pouring down on the wicked like floodwaters. He claimed to hear God's voice directly, giving him specific instructions, naming specific sinners who must be punished before Christ's return. Most towns ran him off after a few days. His preaching was too intense, too frightening, too prone to inciting violence. But Bodhi was different. Bodhi needed a preacher. Not because the people wanted salvation. Most couldn't have spelled the word. But because having a church, having religion, made Bodhi feel legitimate, civilized, respectable. It separated them from nameless mining camps that appeared and vanished within months. A church meant permanence, community, a future. So when Reverend Josiah Blackwood walked into Bodhi's only saloon on December 15, 1877, stood in the center of the room, raised his Bible above his head and shouted, "Repent! For the kingdom of God is at hand." Judgment comes to Bodhi this Christmas. The wicked shall burn in eternal fire. Instead of throwing him out, people listened. Because deep down beneath the greed and violence and whiskey-soaked bravado, every man in that saloon knew he was guilty of something. Every man had killed, stolen, cheated, abandoned families, broken oaths, committed sins so black that even mentioning them aloud would earn a bullet. And every man feared judgment. So they listened, and Josiah Blackwood smiled. A cold, terrible smile that showed too many teeth. Because he'd found his flock, his damn doomed flock, the sermons. For the next 3 days, Josiah preached in the largest saloon in Bodhi, Murphy's Exchange, owned by a former San Francisco bar owner named Daniel Murphy, who charged Josiah $1 a day for the privilege of driving away his paying customers. Josiah preached morning, noon, and night, his voice hoarse and rasping, his sermons lasting 4, 5, sometimes 6 hours without pause. He quoted scripture obsessively, mostly from Revelation, Ezekiel, and the Old Testament prophets, the violent apocalyptic passages that spoke of cities destroyed, the earth cleansed by fire, God's terrible swift sword cutting down the unrighteous. "This town is Sodom," he screamed, spit flying from his lips, his eyes wild and rolling. "This town is Gomorrah. God destroyed those cities with fire and brimstone, and he will destroy Bodhi the same way unless you repent, unless you turn from your wickedness and embrace righteousness." His sermons were terrifying, visceral, filled with graphic descriptions of hell. The flames, the screaming, the eternal torment, the bodies writhing in agony for all eternity while demons laughed and God turned his face away in disgust. And people came, not just miners and drifters, but merchants, families, even prostitutes from Virgin Alley who'd never set foot in a church, who didn't know a single Bible verse, but who remembered prayers their mothers taught them as children. Have wondered if it was too late, if God could still save them, if there was any hope left for their blackened souls. By December 18th, Josiah's congregation numbered over 200. By December 20th, it was over 400, and with each sermon, Josiah's message grew darker. He stopped talking about salvation, stopped talking about God's mercy or Christ's love or redemption through faith. He talked only about judgment, about punishment, about the need to cleanse Bodhi of sin before Christmas Day, before Christ's birth, before the holy moment when God would look down upon the earth and judge every town, every soul, every heart. You cannot be saved while living among the wicked, Josiah shouted on December 21st, his voice echoing through the packed saloon, his finger stabbing toward his congregation like an accusation. You cannot wash your hands while standing in a river of blood. Bodhi must be purged. The sinners must be removed. Only then can God's grace descend upon this place. How? Someone shouted from the crowd, a miner named Jacob Reese, a big man with a scarred face and blood on his hands from more than one killing. How do we purge the town? How do we remove the sinners? Josiah Blackwood smiled that terrible smile. God has given me a list, he said softly, pulling a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket. God has named them. God has judged them. And God commands that we execute his holy judgment before Christmas morning. He unfolded the paper slowly, dramatically, like Moses revealing the 10 Commandments. These are the 17 souls who have been weighed in God's balance and found wanting, Josiah intoned. These are the 17 who must die before sunrise on Christmas Day, so that Bodhi might be cleansed and made worthy of God's blessing. He began to read names. The list. The 17 names on Josiah Blackwood's list represented a cross-section of Bodhi's population. Not the worst criminals, not the most violent killers, but a carefully chosen selection designed to create maximum fear and compliance. 3 saloon owners who'd refused to let Josiah preach in their establishments without payment. 2 prostitutes who'd laughed when Josiah approached them on Virgin Alley, telling them to repent or burn. A Chinese opium den operator named Wu Shen, who'd ignored Josiah's demands to close his business. 4 professional gamblers who'd been reported cheating at cards. Josiah claimed God had revealed their crimes in a vision. A mine superintendent named Harold Croft, who'd fired a worker for attending Josiah's sermons instead of reporting for his shift. 2 Mexican miners who'd been accused of theft, never proven, never prosecuted, but Josiah claimed God had convicted them. A widow named Catherine Price who ran a boarding house and had asked Josiah to leave when he tried to conduct prayer meetings that disturbed her paying tenants. A newspaper editor named Samuel Winters, who'd written an editorial mocking Josiah's sermons and calling him a charlatan and fraud. A 13-year-old boy named Thomas Murphy, son of the saloon owner who'd allowed Josiah to preach, who'd been caught stealing candy from the general store. A 13-year-old child on a list of people who must die. When Josiah read that name, a murmur of shock rippled through the congregation. Even in body, even among men who'd killed and stolen and lived without law, there were lines you didn't cross. Children were off limits. Always. God does not exempt the young from judgment, Josiah shouted, his voice rising to a shriek. God does not grant mercy based on age. This boy is a thief. The Bible says, "Thou shalt not steal." The penalty for theft is death. Thus saith the Lord. Silence filled the saloon. And then, slowly, heads began to nod. Because Josiah had spent 3 days breaking down resistance, sowing fear, convincing these desperate, guilty, terrified souls that only through obedience to God, through his interpretation of God's will, could they avoid eternal damnation. He'd convinced them that mercy was weakness, that questioning was sin, that doubt was damnation, and that anyone who refused to participate in God's judgment would themselves be judged. On December 22nd, 1877, Josiah Blackwood established what he called the Court of Heaven, a kangaroo court held in Murphy's Exchange saloon, with Josiah as judge, 12 of his most devoted followers as jury, and the entire congregation as witness. The 17 accused were rounded up by a mob of over 100 men and brought to the saloon in chains, actual chains, scavenged from mine equipment, padlocked around wrists and ankles. The accused ranged in age from 13 to 64. They included men, women, Chinese, Mexican, and white Americans. They had nothing in common except Josiah's conviction that they were sinners who must die. The trials were a mockery of justice. Each accused was brought before Josiah's makeshift bench, a table stacked with crates to elevate him above the crowd like a judge in a courtroom. Josiah read the charges from his list, quoted scripture about their particular sin, and asked the jury for a verdict. Every verdict was the same: guilty. No evidence was presented. No defense was allowed. No witnesses were called. The accused weren't permitted to speak. When one man, a gambler named Jonathan Wells, tried to defend himself, shouting that the charges were lies, that he'd done nothing wrong, Josiah had him gagged and dragged away. The trials lasted from dawn till sunset on December 27th. All 17 were convicted. All 17 were sentenced to hang. The executions would take place on Christmas Eve, at midnight, so that by the time Christmas morning dawned, body would be purged, cleansed, made holy. December 24th, 1877, Christmas Eve. At 11 p.m., Josiah led a torchlit procession from Murphy's Exchange to a cottonwood tree on the outskirts of town. Over 300 people followed, some singing hymns, some silent and grim, some drunk and laughing, treating the executions like entertainment. The 17 condemned were brought in a wagon, chained together, guarded by armed men from Josiah's inner circle. Ropes had been prepared, 17 nooses tied by a former sailor who'd learned the knot during his years at sea. The cottonwood tree was massive, its branches thick and strong enough to support multiple bodies. At 11:30 p.m., Josiah opened his Bible and began to preach one final sermon. Standing in the wagon bed, his face illuminated by torchlight, his voice carrying across the frozen darkness. "Tonight we do God's work," he shouted. "Tonight we cleanse body of sin. Tonight we prove our righteousness before the Almighty. Let no man question this. Let no man doubt. For God has spoken, and we are his instruments." At 11:45 p.m., the first condemned was brought forward, Wu Chen, the Chinese opium den operator. He was 53 years old, had come to America in 1852 to work on the railroads, had saved every penny, had sent money home to his family in Guangdong province for 25 years. He'd opened the opium den because it was the only business white society allowed Chinese men to operate. He'd hurt no one, killed no one. He was just trying to survive in a country that hated him. The noose was placed around his neck. Josiah read from the Bible, "The wages of sin is death." Wu Shen closed his eyes and whispered a prayer in Cantonese, probably to his ancestors, probably asking them to watch over his family when he was gone. At 11:50 p.m., the wagon lurched forward. Wu Shen dropped. The noose snapped tight. His body swung in the freezing air, jerking and twitching for nearly 2 minutes before going still. The crowd was silent, and then someone began to sing. "Silent Night, Holy Night." Others joined in, their voices rising into the darkness. A Christmas carol sung, while a man slowly strangled to death 10 feet away. One by one, the condemned were hanged. The 2 prostitutes, Mary Sullivan and Rosa Martinez, who cried and begged and swore they'd repent, they'd change, they'd leave body and never come back. "Please God, please, don't kill us." The nooses were placed. The wagon moved. They dropped. The 4 gamblers who faced death with grim silence, their faces hard, their eyes empty, having seen too much death to fear their own. The saloon owners who cursed Josiah until the nooses choked off their voices. The mine superintendent who shouted that this was murder, that someone would answer for this, that his family in San Francisco would send lawmen in to investigate, to prosecute, to hang every man here. No one listened. The wagon moved. He dropped. By 12:30 a.m. Christmas morning, 13 bodies swung from the cottonwood tree, turning slowly in the winter wind, casting long shadows in the torchlight. 4 remained, the 2 Mexican miners, the widow, Catherine Price, and the boy, Thomas Murphy, 13 years old. When they brought the boy forward, something changed. A murmur ran through the crowd. Men who'd watched 13 people die without protest suddenly shifted uncomfortably. Mothers clutched their own children closer. Even some of Josiah's most devoted followers looked uncertain. "Reverend," one man called out, Jacob Reese, the same man who'd first asked how to purge the town. Maybe the boy's too young. Maybe God would show mercy too." "Silence," Josiah roared, his eyes blazing with madness and absolute conviction. "God shows mercy to none who defy his law. God showed no mercy to the children of Sodom, no mercy to the firstborn of Egypt. The boy is a thief. The boy must die. This is God's will." Thomas Murphy stood at the base of the tree, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror, tears streaming down his cheeks. He was small for 13, thin and underfed, dressed in ragged clothes too large for his frame. His father, Daniel Murphy, the saloon owner who'd allowed Josiah to preach in his establishment, who'd supported the preacher, who'd participated in the trials, stood at the edge of the crowd, watching his son, his face twisted in agony. "Please," Daniel whispered, so softly almost no one heard. "Please, not my boy. Take me instead. I'm the sinner, not him. Please." Josiah ignored him. The noose was placed around Thomas's neck. The boy looked at his father one last time. "Papa?" he whispered. "Papa, help me." Daniel Murphy broke. He screamed, a terrible, inhuman sound, and rushed forward, shoving through the crowd, reaching for his son. Two of Josiah's men grabbed him, held him back, wrestled him to the ground. "Papa!" Thomas screamed. "Papa, don't let them." The wagon moved. Thomas dropped. But something went wrong. The noose was tied incorrectly, or the boy was too light, or God himself intervened. No one could ever agree on what happened next. Thomas didn't die. The rope tightened, cutting off his air, but his neck didn't break. He hung there, choking, gasping, his legs kicking desperately, his hands clawing at the rope around his throat. For over 5 minutes he strangled slowly, his face turning purple, his eyes bulging, his mouth opening and closing like a fish drowning in air. The crowd watched in horrified silence, and Daniel Murphy, still pinned to the ground by Josiah's men, screamed and screamed and screamed. Finally, mercifully, Thomas went still. Josiah looked at the crowd, his face serene, peaceful, as if he'd just witnessed something holy. "It is finished," he said softly. "Body is cleansed." And then, from somewhere in the darkness beyond the torchlight, someone laughed. A child's laugh, high and bright and wrong. Everyone froze. The laughter came again, closer this time, echoing from multiple directions, as if there were dozens of children hiding in the darkness, laughing at a joke only they understood. And then they saw them. Children, dozens of children, standing at the edge of the torchlight, their faces pale, their eyes black and empty, their mouths stretched in two wide smiles. They were the children who died in body over the years, from disease, accidents, exposure, violence. Children buried in unmarked graves. Children whose deaths had gone unmourned, unnoticed, forgotten, and they'd come to witness the hanging of one of their own. The crowd broke. People screamed and ran, dropping torches, trampling each other in their panic to escape. Josiah's men released Daniel Murphy and fled into the night. Within minutes, the clearing was empty except for Josiah, the 14 bodies swinging from the tree, and the ghost children watching in silence. Josiah stood alone, his Bible clutched to his chest, his face frozen in an expression of dawning horror as he finally understood what he'd done. The children began to move forward, slowly, in perfect unison. "No," Josiah whispered. "No, I was doing God's work. I was righteous. I was." The children reached him, and what they did to Josiah Blackwood in the darkness beneath that cottonwood tree was never recorded, never spoken of, never fully known. But the screaming lasted until dawn. When sunrise came on December 25th, 1877, the townspeople returned to the hanging tree. 14 bodies still swung from the branches, the 13 adults and the boy. Josiah Blackwood was found at the base of the tree. He was still alive, barely. His body was broken in ways that defied explanation. Bone shattered, skin torn, his face a ruin of clawed flesh. His eyes were gone, scooped from their sockets, leaving empty, weeping holes. But his tongue still worked. He whispered the same thing over and over, for the 3 hours it took him to die. They took their judgment, the children took their judgment, they wouldn't let me repent. They said it was too late. They said I had to pay. They said I had to pay forever. The 14 bodies were cut down and buried in a mass grave at the edge of the cemetery, as far from consecrated ground as possible. Josiah Blackwood's body was burned, not buried, burned, and his ashes scattered in the desert, with salt poured over the ground where his body had lain. The cottonwood tree was cut down in January 1878, chopped into pieces and burned. The ashes were buried. The ground was blessed by a traveling priest. Rocks were piled over the spot to mark it as cursed ground where nothing should ever grow again. But every Christmas Eve, at midnight, people walking past that spot report hearing it. 14 voices screaming as they die, a child crying for his father, and beneath it all, Josiah Blackwood's voice, whispering in eternal agony. They wouldn't let me repent. They said it was too late. They said I had to pay forever. Because in body, judgment is eternal, and mercy is for those who showed mercy. Josiah Blackwood showed none, and he received none in return, forever. The Gold That Screams. Christmas, 1880. Our seventh and final original story takes us to Christmas 1880, the year 3 miners discovered the richest vein of gold ever found in body, and learned too late that some treasures carry a price no man should pay. The Standard Consolidated Mine was one of Body's most productive operations, extending over 1,200 feet deep into the earth, with tunnels branching in all directions like the roots of a massive tree. Thousands of men had worked those tunnels since 1877, extracting millions of dollars worth of gold and silver ore. But there was one section of the mine that no one worked. Level 9, North Drift, Section 7C. It had been sealed off in 1878 after a cave-in killed 11 men. The company declared it unstable, too dangerous to excavate, not worth the risk. A heavy timber door was installed at the entrance, padlocked, marked with a painted warning. Danger. Do not enter. Cave-in risk. Violators will be fired. For 2 years, that section remained sealed. Forgotten. Just another casualty in a mine that had claimed over 40 lives since opening. Until Christmas Eve, 1880, when 3 miners decided to break in. Henry Blake, age 29, was the ringleader. He'd been working in the Standard Mine for 3 years, long enough to know every tunnel, every shaft, every story whispered by old-timers who'd been there since the beginning. Henry was smart, ambitious, and convinced he was destined for something greater than spending 10 hours a day swinging a pickaxe in darkness for $3.50 a day. He'd heard the rumors about Section 7C, that the cave-in happened because the miners had broken through into something they shouldn't have, something rich beyond imagining, something the company wanted kept secret so they could mine it themselves later without sharing profits with workers. Sean Murphy, age 32nd, was Henry's best friend and partner in every harebrained scheme. Sean was Irish, big and strong as an ox, with a booming laugh and a love of whiskey that had cost him better jobs in San Francisco. He'd followed Henry to Body, and he'd follow him into hell if Henry promised there was money at the end. And Marcus Webb, age 26, was the youngest, the newest, the most desperate. His wife Ellen was 5 months pregnant. They'd come to Body in September, dreaming of striking it rich, but Marcus barely made enough to keep them fed and sheltered. He'd been looking for any opportunity to earn more money, to give his growing family something better than a one-room shack with gaps in the walls where wind howled through. On Christmas Eve afternoon, after their shift ended at 4:00 p.m., the 3 men waited until the mine was nearly empty. Most miners had left early for Christmas celebrations and made their way down to level 9. They carried pickaxes, lanterns, a pry bar to break the padlock, and enough explosives to blast through any collapsed tunnel they found. At 5:30 p.m., they broke open the door to Section 7C. At 5:32 p.m., they entered the forbidden tunnel. By 11 p.m., they would be screaming. The air in Section 7C was wrong. That was Henry's first thought as they stepped through the doorway into darkness beyond their lantern light. The air was too warm. The deeper you went in mines, the colder it got. But here it was warm, almost hot, as if they were walking into a furnace instead of into the earth. And the smell. It wasn't the normal smell of mines, rock dust, timber, dampness, the faint sulfur tang of blasting powder. It was something organic, something rotten, like meat left too long in summer heat. "Christ," Sean muttered, covering his nose with his bandana. "Smells like something died down here." "Probably rats," Henry said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Or maybe those 11 miners from 78 are still down here. Come on. We didn't come this far to turn back because of a bad smell." They walked deeper into the tunnel, their lanterns casting dancing shadows on the rough stone walls. The tunnel was narrower than the main drifts, barely 5 feet tall, forcing them to walk bent over, their shoulders brushing the wall. After about 200 feet, they reached the cave-in. It wasn't as bad as the company had claimed. A section of the tunnel roof had collapsed, filling maybe 30 feet of passage with broken rock and timber, but it wasn't impassable. They could see gaps in the rubble, spaces where air flowed through, suggesting there was an open tunnel on the other side. "We can dig through this," Henry said, excitement building in his voice. "Give us a few hours, we'll be on the other side." And if the company lied about how bad the cave-in was, what else did they lie about? They set to work. For 3 hours, they dug, moving rocks, pulling away splintered timbers, widening gaps in the rubble, until they created a passage barely large enough for a man to crawl through. At 8:45 p.m., Henry squeezed through first, his lantern held ahead of him, scraping his back and shoulders on jagged rock. He emerged on the other side and stood up, and gasped, "Sean, Marcus, get through here. Now." Sean and Marcus scrambled through the opening, emerging into what lay beyond. A cavern, not a mine tunnel. A natural cavern, maybe 50 feet across and 30 feet high, its walls glittering with veins of gold, so pure, so rich, so impossibly abundant that it looked like the walls themselves were made of solid gold. "Holy Mother of God," Sean whispered. The gold wasn't just in veins, it was everywhere. Nuggets the size of fists embedded in the rock. Sheets of pure gold leaf peeling away from the walls like skin. Deposits so rich you could scrape handfuls of gold dust from the floor. This wasn't just valuable. This was a fortune beyond imagination. This was enough gold to make them richer than the mine owners, richer than anyone in California. Henry laughed. A high, wild sound. "We're rich. Do you understand? We're rich." Marcus fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. "Ellen the first and understand. Everything. A real house. Doctors when the baby comes. We'll never be hungry again. Never cold. Never." "Start filling sacks," Henry interrupted, already pulling a canvas bag from his pack. "We'll take as much as we can carry tonight. Then we come back tomorrow, Christmas Day, when the mines close. We'll make multiple trips. This cave is ours now. Ours." They worked with frantic energy, scraping gold from the walls, prying loose nuggets, filling their sacks until they were bulging, impossibly heavy. At 10:15 p.m., with their sacks full and their pockets stuffed with nuggets, they prepared to leave. That's when they heard it. Screaming. Distant, echoing, barely audible, but unmistakable. Human screaming. Coming from deeper in the cavern, from a section they hadn't explored yet. "What the hell was that?" Sean whispered, his face pale. "The wind," Henry said, though he didn't believe it. "Just wind through the tunnels. Sounds like screaming sometimes." The sound came again, louder this time, more distinct. It wasn't wind. It was voices. Plural. Dozens of voices. Men's voices, screaming in agony, screaming for help, screaming words that were almost clear enough to understand. "We need to leave," Marcus said, his voice shaking. "Right now. Something's wrong here. Something's—" "Don't be stupid," Henry snapped. "It's probably miners trapped somewhere in the tunnels. Maybe survivors from the cave-in. We can't just leave them." "Henry, that cave-in was 2 years ago. If anyone was trapped, they're dead. Then it's something else. But we can't." The screaming grew louder, more intense, more desperate. And then from the darkness at the far end of the cavern, they heard footsteps, running footsteps, dozens of them, coming closer. "Run!" Sean shouted. They grabbed their sacks and ran for the narrow opening in the cave-in rubble. Sean went first, dropping his sack, squeezing through the gap, his lantern smashing as he scrambled. Marcus followed, also abandoning his sack, terror overriding greed. Henry hesitated for just a moment, one precious, fatal moment, looking back at the gold they were leaving behind, at the fortune scattered on the cavern floor. And in that moment he saw them. Men, dozens of men, stumbling out of the darkness at the far end of the cavern. But they weren't alive. Their faces were wrong, skin hanging in strips, bones visible through rotted flesh, eyes gone, mouths open in eternal screams. Their mining clothes were in tatters, their bodies broken and twisted. They were the 11 miners who died in the cave-in 2 years ago, and they were running toward Henry. He screamed and dove for the opening, his sack of gold still clutched in his hand, scraping through the narrow gap just as skeletal hands grabbed for his ankles. He exploded out the other side, gasping, his heart hammering. Sean and Marcus were already running up the tunnel toward the main shaft. "Move!" Henry shouted, scrambling to his feet. They ran. Behind them, from the other side of the rubble, the screaming grew louder, more frenzied, and they heard the sound of rocks shifting, moving, as if something was digging through from the other side. They didn't stop running until they reached level 8, then level 7, finally emerging onto the surface at 10:47 p.m. The night air was freezing, 15 degree F, but after the warm horror of that cavern it felt like salvation. They collapsed in the snow, gasping, shaking, covered in rock dust and sweat. What Marcus panted. "What the hell was that?" "I don't know," Henry whispered, "but we're never going back down there. Never." Sean started to laugh, a broken, half-hysterical sound. "But you still brought your sack." Henry looked down. He was still clutching the canvas sack, his fingers locked around it in a death grip. The gold. He'd kept the gold. Henry Blake woke on Christmas morning in his rented room on Green Street, feeling like he'd been beaten with hammers. Every muscle ached. His head throbbed. His hands were torn and bloody from scraping through the rubble. But he smiled, because sitting on the floor next to his bed was the canvas sack. The gold. His salvation. His future. His way out of body forever. He got up, locked his door, and dumped the sack's contents onto his bed. It was even more than he remembered. Nuggets ranging from pea-size to the size of small potatoes. Sheets of gold leaf. Crystalline formations that looked like frozen fire. He estimated at least 20 pounds of high-grade ore. At current prices, this was worth $6,000, the equivalent of $180,000 today. Enough to leave body, buy land in Sacramento, start a business, live like a gentleman for the rest of his life. He spent Christmas Day hidden in his room, organizing the gold, planning his departure, imagining his new life. He didn't hear the whispering. Not yet. The madness. On December 26th, Henry visited an assayer in town, a man named George Potter, who asked no questions and could be trusted to keep secrets for a price. George examined the ore with professional interest, testing samples with acid, weighing pieces on a precision scale, making notes in his ledger. "This is exceptional quality," George said quietly. "Where did you get this?" "That's my business." "Fair enough. I'll give you $4,800 for the lot. Cash. Today. The gold's worth $6,000 at least." George shrugged. "You want full value? Go to San Francisco and find a licensed refinery. But then you'd have to answer questions about where it came from. I'm offering no questions in cash today. Take it or leave it." Henry thought about the dead miners. The screaming. The hands reaching for him in the darkness. "I'll take it." George counted out $4,800 in gold coins and bills. Henry stuffed the money in his coat, shook George's hand, and walked out. He felt like a king for about 30 minutes. Then, walking back to his room, he heard it. Thief, you stole from us. That gold was ours. We died for that gold. Henry spun around. The street behind him was empty. Give it back. The gold belongs to the dead. Give it back. Give it back. The voice was coming from inside his head. For the next 3 days, the whispers never stopped. Day and night, waking and sleeping, he heard them. The voices of the 11 dead miners, demanding he return the gold, cursing him, promising revenge. He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't think about anything except those voices. On December 29th, Henry tried to give the money away, walking through Body, shoving handfuls of cash at strangers, begging them to take it. Please take it. He didn't want it anymore. People thought he'd gone mad. Maybe he had. On December 30th, Henry Blake returned to the Standard Mine. He told the night foreman he'd forgotten something in the tunnels, needed to go back down, just for a few minutes. The foreman, who'd been drinking and didn't care, waved him through. Henry descended to level 9, walked to section 7C, and forced open the door they'd sealed again. He crawled through the rubble gap into the gold cavern. It was empty now, quiet. The gold still glittered on the walls, and standing in the center of the cavern were 11 figures, the miners, the dead miners, waiting for him. Henry fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm sorry. I brought the money. I brought it all. Take it. Please. Just let me go." He pulled the remaining cash from his coat. He'd given away maybe $800, but over $4,000 remained, and threw it at the feet of the dead miners. Bills fluttered to the ground. The figures didn't move. "The money means nothing," they whispered in unison, their voices like wind through a tune. "The gold belongs here, in the earth, in the darkness. You took it. Now you stay." "No," Henry whispered. "No, please." The figures moved forward. Henry screamed, and the cavern collapsed. Henry Blake's body was found on January 15, 1881, by a mining crew investigating strange noises, screaming sounds coming from the sealed section of level 9. They broke through the cave-in and found him in the gold cavern. He was buried up to his waist in gold ore, as if the cavern floor had turned liquid, swallowed him, then solidified again, trapping him like an insect in amber. His mouth was open in a scream. His hands were raised, palms out, as if trying to ward something off. And his eyes were solid gold, not covered in gold dust, not painted, transformed. The soft tissue of his eyeballs had been replaced by solid metallic gold, gleaming in the lantern light. The mining crew backed away in horror. The company sealed Section 7C permanently, not with a timber door this time, but with concrete and steel, filling the entrance completely. The cavern was never entered again. But even today, miners working in nearby sections of the Standard Mine report hearing something through the walls, screaming, and beneath the screaming, a voice whispering, "The gold belongs to the dead. The gold stays in the earth. The gold will scream until you return what you stole. Because in Body, some treasures are more cursed than blessing, and some gold is worth more than money. It's worth your soul, forever."